So we talked about how the Romantics see the world differently, right? They don't see this mechanistic picture of the universe. They see man in organic and developmental terms. Um, so we'll talk next a little bit about how the Romantics see nature. And I love this quote by Francis Bacon, really not a romantic, based on the time that he lives in, but I think it captures the ethos of the Romantic movement really well when Bacon says, "We cannot command nature except by obeying her." What does that mean? I mean, it means that we can't have any control over nature at all. And I think that's a really romantic way of looking at the world, because the Romantics see nature as this really organic process that humans are a part of. It's not that we can control it, right? That we can sort of manipulate nature like a puppet, which is very different than what Descartes believes, right? Because Descartes says we can and should become the masters and possessors of nature. Nature is not something we can control that way. The Romantics also see nature as freedom, right? Freedom from the boring, stifling conventions of human society. Society is artificial. It's too cramped and too conventional. We want freedom from all of that, so we go out into nature. There are two ways, though, that the Romantics view nature, and one of them is in terms of the beautiful, right? Nature is pretty. It's really nice to go out into nature and go camping and hear all those crickets, but they also view nature in terms of the sublime. So I have to explain what the sublime means to you. One way of doing that is sort of, I'm going to show you this poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And, when you read this poem, imagine yourself on a boat in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of winter. You're all alone. Maybe your crew is asleep, and it's the middle of the night, and it's really creepy out there. It's very cold, and reading this poem, you're supposed to feel something, right? You're supposed to feel like you're out there. You're all alone. You feel like the universe is vast and big, and you're dwarfed in comparison to it. So that's kind of what Romanticism takes from nature when they talk about the sublime. It's not just this fascination with the outdoors and nature, but it's this understanding that nature is terrifying, right? It has this raw energy, and it can have this really unbridled power over us. Nature can kill us, right? Like I'll talk about in a second when I talk about Into the Wild. But you think about like the possibility of a tornado just coming out of nowhere and devastating an entire community. That's what part of the sublime is, right? It's this understanding that nature can totally control us. But the Romantics don't want to run away from that. They want to try to confront that terror of nature. There's this really great book called Into the Wild where a guy named Christopher McCandless decides to just leave everything, right? He graduates from college and he sells all of his stuff and he takes a backpack and he hitchhikes around the country and he ends up in Alaska and he wants to live off the land. He doesn't make it, unfortunately. Nature wins in this battle, but there's a book that John Krakauer has written about Christopher McCandless' story, and it's told through letters and postcards that he sent to other people. And here's something he said to a friend. He wrote to a friend and said the following that I really think embodies the Romantic spirit. He said, "So many people live within unhappy circumstances and yet will not take the initiative to change their situation because they're conditioned to a life of security, conformity, and conservatism. And all of these things might appear to give us a peace of mind, but he says there's nothing more damaging to the adventurous spirit within a man than a secure future. The very basic core of a man's living spirit is his passion for adventure." And I think that's something that the Romantics take really seriously, right? The fact that we've been put on this earth to kind of explore it, but not to conquer it, to live in harmony with it. McCandless says the joy of life comes from our encounters with new experiences. And so there's no greater joy than to have an endlessly changing horizon and for each day to have a new and different sun. So I think that really embodies the spirit of the romantic view of nature. So let's talk a little bit more about the sublime. There's a distinction to be made between the sublime and the beautiful, right? And I think Kant makes this distinction really well in this piece that he wrote in 1764. So when you imagine the sublime, you're supposed to imagine things like tall oaks and lonely shadows in a sacred grove. Whereas the beautiful in nature is something that it can be kind of tamed, kind of maintained, right? So flower beds and low hedges and trees that are trimmed in figures. The beautiful represents the control that man can have over nature, right? Or the natural beauty. But really that the sublime represents the natural beauty that we're kind of unable to comprehend. So the sublime moves while the beautiful charms. And then he says further, the sublime, its feeling is sometimes accompanied with a certain dread or melancholy, and in some cases, a quiet wonder. So he distinguishes between the terrifying sublime, the noble sublime, and the splendid sublime. But the thing to understand is that really the sublime refers to what's beyond our comprehension, right? The absolutely great in nature. So the peaks of the Swiss Alps, right? The thickets of the forest that seem like a mystery to us when we just look at them. The bigness of nature, right? Driving by the Appalachian Mountains for the first time and you just sort of see how big they are, right? The sublime is that with which everything else is small, in comparison with which everything else is small. And so this is a really good, Edmund Burke also has this really great take on the sublime, where he says, the passion caused by the great and the sublime in nature is astonishment. Astonishment is that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. The mind then is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other. So it's that awe of us, like being in nature and experiencing nature and understanding that we cannot control nature. That's what the sublime is all about. Now, I'm talking about this so much because you see it so much in Frankenstein. So I want to draw your attention to a couple of places that you'll encounter Mary Shelley's sort of take on the sublime here. If you look on page 64 of the Dover Thrift Edition, this is a scene where Victor is hiking in the Alps, and he's all by himself, he's cold, and it's the middle of winter, and the scene that sort of takes place around him is really, really sublime. So the immense mountains and precipices that overhung me on every side, the sound of the river raging among the rocks. You're supposed to get this image of actually being there. The mighty Alps, whose white and shining pyramids and domes towered above all as if belonging to another earth, the habitations of another race of beings. A terrifically desolate scene, and he talks about the trees that are broken and strewn on the ground, the ravines of snow, right, where these stones fall down into, and you look down and you realize, like, in an instant you could be killed, right, if you took the slightest misstep, or if you made the slightest sound. Could send an avalanche falling down on you. So the sublime in Frankenstein is really important, and I draw your attention to this because a lot of people get hung up in this text with these passages where it's just very descriptive, and she's talking about nature, and you're just like, get me to the action, get me to the monster, right? But there's something really important going on here. The sublime actually becomes kind of a character in the novel. The other thing to understand here is that Victor's quest to create life is actually a quest for the sublime, right? It's a quest to attain that greatness beyond all possibility of calculation, of imitation. So the fact that he is trying to create a human being is his attempt at attaining the sublime. So you can see this on page 30 when he talks about the intricacies of life, and how, you know, how he plans on trying to become God, basically, to create something as sublime as the human form. So I'll stop that one there, and then we'll get on to talking a little more detail about the novel.